So I want to begin by thanking Craig for, he's been sort of a mentor to me, and I got to know him from a distance here in the colonies, and communicated with him a little bit by phone and by Zoom at first. And then he's become more of a mentor to me recently. And I know some of his friends, and so I know a little bit about his life that he hasn't told me about, and admire the sort of prophetic stance he's taken on this issue and others, even in spite of the fact that at times he's been sort of pushed aside or ostracized as a minister, and also in his teaching vocation because of his prophetic stance. And it reminds me, Martin Luther and a number of different Christian leaders have said something to the effect of, if we are faithful at every point on the Christian faith, except that very issue in which the culture is pressing in on us, and if we capitulate on that one issue, then we're not really being faithful at all. And I think there's a need for us to be willing to speak prophetically, especially on the social, cultural, and political issues where a faithful Christian is most out of step with society. And so I wanted to speak a little bit today on the issue that sort of underlies racial division and racial reconciliation. One of the issues, I think the most significant issue, and that is the issue of authority. God's authority, and then the authority he delegates to human beings. Because when we get confused on this issue, the first casualty is humanity. That human dignity goes by the wayside. And there's a story told of a farmer in Texas who was repairing his tractor one day there on the farm. And a black SUV pulled up, and a man got out and announced himself as a agent of the DEA, that's the Drug Enforcement Agency here in America. And he said to the farmer, I've been tasked with inspecting all the farms here in this community to see if there are any illegal drugs being grown. And the farmer said, sure, help yourself. But if I were you, I wouldn't go over into that field over to your left. And the young DEA agent, sort of offended that his authority had been called into question, pulled his badge out of his pocket and said, do you see this badge? This badge says I've got all of the authority of the federal government at my back. I can do whatever I want to on your farm, and you can't stop me. Do you understand? Look at this badge. Look at it. The farmer said, very well, carry on. And a little bit later, as he was working on his tractor, he heard a commotion, and he looked over to the field on his left, and the DEA agent was running for his life. Every step he took, there was a bull behind him who would take 2 steps. So the farmer dropped his tools, ran immediately over to the fence, and he said, agent, show him your badge. Show him your badge. And I think that's sort of the amusing part of that story, is that it shows a misunderstanding of authority, a confusion of authority. The DEA agent might have had authority over the farmer and his property, but I think the bull may perhaps have not recognized that authority. And I think we've got a conflict of authority here in the States. And in relation to this, the Christian tradition has always affirmed that God is the supreme authority in all human affairs, and that he has delegated authority, however, to human beings so that we can fulfill our offices. And he designates to the church the keys of the kingdom, and that's a certain authority to proclaim the gospel. And I just want to ask briefly today and give a hint of an answer of how we properly exercise our authority to proclaim the gospel in an authority-confused context. So here in the States, I think the secularization process has gathered steam since the 60s and continues to gather steam. Think of the work of Jewish American sociologist Philip Reith, upon whom Craig draws regularly, who argued that there has been an attempt by the cultural elite in America, whom he calls the officer class, an attempt to sever social order from sacred order and leave social order floating on its own, and that this has been and will be deleterious. And of course, there's never a social order floating on its own. There's always a sacred order of some sort beneath it, but the seculars have kicked the Christian faith out the front door and whistled in a secular faith through the back. I think of the work of Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, who, in addition to the sort of his intellectual genealogy that Reef gives, also gives sort of a psychology. He explores the existential feel of living in a secular age. And one of the things he talks about is the extraordinary moral inarticulacy that has resulted. That whereas in the past, when we had disagreements in the West, we had in mind a common moral framework, a transcendent moral framework, and we drew upon that same framework. Even atheists and agnostics in general recognized the basics of the moral law. And we would draw upon the same moral framework and have our disagreements. And yet now that the moral framework has been jettisoned, each person is left to find his own moral framework. And instead of arguing together toward truth, we sort of argue against each other. And so disagreement takes on a sort of personal animus. And then I think of finally the American philosopher and economist Thomas Sowell. In his book, Conflict of Visions, he explores two different ways of responding to the social ills that have arisen in our secular context, what he calls the unconstrained vision and what he calls the constrained vision. And in general, somebody who has not lashed themselves to the biblical faith is going to take an unconstrained vision and not recognize the finitude and the fallenness of human beings, and is going to have a sort of an exuberant confidence in society's managers, bureaucrats, and elite to envision a new utopia of some sort, then to clear the decks of society and replace our historic institutions and traditions with their utopian aspirations. And for those of us who are believers, we're going to take a more constrained vision, that humans are both finite and fallen, and that our best social managers have limited knowledge and limited ability to seek the good, to seek the common good. And we're going to seek reform through the institutions that we already have. We want to reform them so that they exude justice and a certain rightness about them. So what about the church's authority to preach the gospel in a secular age? Just 2 points really quickly. One, I think that our witness, our gospel witness and proclamation should be holistic. Holistic in the sense of combining words and deeds. That if you were to compare Christian ministry to, say, the wheel of a car that has both a hub and a rim, that our verbal proclamation could be compared to the hub. This is an analogy given by the Honorable Christopher Wright, who is on this call, gave this to me in a personal conversation. You know, if without a hub, the wheel collapses. There's no real Christian ministry that goes on when we hide the words of the gospel. And yet at the same time, our actions are similar to the spokes or the rim of a wheel, in that they give our words traction. And so while not every word is accompanied by a deed, and while not every deed is accompanied by a word, the combined and cumulative effect of Christian witness should be both word and deed. And then it should involve both the church as an institute and the church as an organism. Church as an institution is meets in a human environment and utilizes a human language and declares that Jesus is Lord and Caesar is not. And it's a powerful political moment every week on Sunday morning when God's people gather to celebrate through word and table and declare that Jesus is Lord and Caesar is not. But our witness doesn't end there, because we disperse. Luther spoke of this as a church scattered. Kuyper spoke of it more helpfully, I think, as the church organic, that we remain connected to Christ at the head and connected to one another as we go and venture into the various spheres of culture, art and scientific, politics, economics, marriage and family, sports and competition, business and entrepreneurship, and such like, and try to, as best we can, provide healing and redirection to the corruption and misdirection we experience in culture at large. And then finally, I want to mention 3 or 4 issues here in the colonies where we're affected by this sort of crisis of authority, a lack of recognition of God's sovereignty and authority, and a confusion as to what we should do with our delegated authority as human beings and our office as image bearers. And the first is the issue of racial division and reconciliation. I won't spend as much time on this because I knew that this would be well covered, but in the States, to be simplistic to the extreme, you've got a group of people who focus almost exclusively on personal prejudice when defining racism. And then you've got another group that focuses almost exclusively on the sort of institutional injustices that perpetuate themselves. When an institution becomes corrupted by any sort of sin, including racism, then racism can be perpetuated institutionally. I think as believers that we should recognize both aspects in our definition of racism and our attempts to overcome it, that personal prejudice and personal animus is coalesces at the social level and cultural level to warp and corrupt institutions. I would mention the matter of the unborn. I think it's a shame indeed. It's another matter of human dignity where God's authority over human life is ignored. Only God has the authority to take the life of an innocent person. Human beings never, ever have the right in warfare or in times of peace to purposefully target as the precise target the innocent blood and to shed innocent blood. And an unborn being is a human being. And the scriptures make very clear that God has intentions for unborn beings. Unborn beings are created in God's image. And they're the weakest and most vulnerable among us. And so I think that's a point of pressure here in the United States to combine truth and grace in terms of our disposition, to argue against what I think is the second environmental disaster in the moral ecology of our country. I think the first environmental disaster was the institution of racism, institution of slavery. And the second environmental disaster in the moral ecology of our nation, just after the civil rights movement, ironically, was the determination by 7 men in black gowns that it would be perfectly fine to deny justice and equality to an entire class of human beings, and that would be the unborn. Third issue is I'll cluster together transgenderism and transhumanism. These are instances in which human beings choose to mutilate their body, thus disrespecting their own dignity, and undermine creation order and God's intention. And I think with a combination of truth and love and with Christian grace, we can encourage people to conform their bodies in relation to transhumanism or transgenderism, to conform their bodies and their disposition and approach to God's design. And then finally, war and peace. I think that's something that's in the perhaps even in the foreground of our minds right now in light of the disastrous events in Ukraine, that God's moral order holds even in times of war. There's nothing more untrue than the statement, all is fair in love and war, and not true at all. And I think that it's important for us to do whatever we can to hold our legislators and leaders accountable for their use of lethal violence, and to hold the leaders of other countries accountable for the use of unjustified lethal violence. And so in conclusion, just wanted to just mention again that as believers whose hope is in the fact that the Lord Christ will return one day to set the world to rights, that the society and culture around us will always place enormous pressure on us at certain points. But that like the Lord Christ, we want to be prophetic, I think as Craig has been, and as many of you have been today, to speak the truth to power. And we want to be willing to be sacrificial, just as the cosmic king of the universe had no place to lay his head, was willing to be tortured and slaughtered on a crucifix. So we should be willing to suffer setback and loss personally for our witness. And then finally, we should take our cues from the Lord Christ in having a humble confidence. Our confidence is the fact that one day he will return to set the world to rights, and justice will roll down like the waters. And yet we're humble because it is he, rather than we, who will set the world to rights. Thank you.